All right, everyone. I am excited to be here with Penousal Machado. Penousal is Associate Professor in the Department of Informatics, as well as Head of the Computational Design and Visualization Lab in the Center of Informatics, or Center for Informatics, at the University of Coimbra. Penousal, welcome to the TWiML AI podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam. I'm delighted to be here.
Hey, I'm really looking forward to digging into our conversation, and we've got lots of exciting stuff to talk about. But let's get started by having you share a little bit about your background and your journey into AI. How did you first get into artificial intelligence?
Well, it was actually from a very young age, which may seem odd, and it's kind of odd now that I think about it. But basically, I think it all happened when I got my first computer. This was a ZX Spectrum from Sinclair Computing. And I got it, I was about 12 or 13 at the time. And this is, of course, I do remember this a lot because it was a fascinating device, really a life-changing event, because entirely different device than anything that I've saw before, and you could do anything, at least in my mind, with it. You could program it, you could create new stuff, you could do graphics. Okay, not very good ones, but at the time for me this was amazing. And oddly enough, I got a few books back then about how to build AI on these machines. I coded something a little bit like Lisa and a few variations, start building a game. And at the same time, there were lots of movies that I saw. I don't know the exact dates, but I do remember a few ones like 2001, of course. But for instance, Electric Dreams, which is not a very good movie, let's put it like that, from the 80s, a little bit cheesy. But it does actually have a very good... I would say it shows a very interesting perspective on AI that kind of stuck into my mind. And then I eventually went to computer science, did my degree, then my master's, and then my PhD, always working on AI. First on case-based reasoning, but then I really specialized in evolutionary computation. That's basically the path, with a few twists in between that are not important.
Awesome. And so you mentioned evolutionary computation. That's one of your research interests. Tell us broadly about the way you think about your research and the various things that you're working on.
Yeah, I probably work in too many things at the time because I get bored, and sometimes I get stuck. And so I change a little bit. And also because I get easily distracted. That's a lot. But overall, my real long-term goal is about AI. That's what fascinates me. So that was my starting point and the initial drive for a career as a researcher, and it still continues to be my key motivation. And oddly enough, it's always about images. I only realized this a few years ago. The things that interest me the most are images, both as a domain of application, but also as an object of study. So everything that I do can really be traced back into these two components, AI and images. And for instance, just to give you an example, when I was finishing my degree, I found totally by accident this paper, these proceedings of SIGGRAPH, and this paper by Carl Sims. The paper is called, this is 1991, I believe, and the paper is something along the lines of Artificial Evolution for Computer Graphics. And this is a seminal paper by Carl Sims, where he is using evolutionary computation to evolve images. And once again, it was one of those wow moments. That stuff was insane, especially back then. We are talking a long time ago, and he was doing this amazing stuff with images and this idea of evolution and so on. And now that again, just talking to you, I also always I'm fascinated by the figure of Charles Darwin and the voyages and the Beagle and so on. So this really clicked and say, okay, this is it. This is evolutionary computation. I was working in case-based reasoning at the time and said, oh no, I'm not into that anymore. So I started specializing in evolutionary computation and using it to evolve images and so on. And for instance, now I'm working also on that, but also working on evolutionary machine learning, because I do think that one of the ways of building intelligent agents is through evolutionary computation. So that's one way to achieve our goals. At the same time, I'm working on computational creativity, and that has to do with my personal view on AI. And kind of by accident, basically because I met this amazing student, Pedro Miguel Cruz, amazing and talented student. I began working in information visualization. And yes, it does seem a little bit odd, but here's my argument is that information visualization is just another way of augmenting human capabilities, of externalizing, for instance, a memory, using simple stuff, using paper and pencil to do math. It's a form of visualization that expands our cognitive abilities. And the way I look into visualization is pretty much along these lines of a way of augmenting, of expanding our cognitive abilities. And that also applies to my view towards AI.
Is your interest in images and graphics, do you think that is personality driven, or an inclination towards the visual, or is there an underlying belief about the way we'll get to AI and it being kind of fundamentally a visual thing that's motivating that?
Well, both, but I would say that it's a matter of personal interest. I've always been fascinated by images, and for instance, I'm not very good at writing, not very good at speaking. Many times to explain an idea, I have to do these charts and figures that nobody really understands, but they make sense to me. So that was really my drive originally. I can present the argument that images are the most important things in the world, and all that stuff. But and I do think that I do believe there is a strong relation between our senses and way and what we are, both as human and as intelligent beings. So I also believe there are lots of, for instance, vision and audition are not so different. There are lots of principles that apply to both domains. So yes, I do strongly believe that they are extremely important for building AI systems, but the initial drive was certainly personal.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about evolutionary computation and what that what that means generally, what that means for you. And we've talked a little bit about evolutionary machine learning on the podcast, but it sounds like you came into the topic of applying evolution to computation from a much broader perspective.
Yeah, that's true. Well, okay, I'll go a little bit back. Something controversial for your podcast. It does pertain with the way I see artificial intelligence. And when most people think about artificial intelligence, they think about problem solving, planning, playing Go, optimization, advertisement, all this stuff. And yes, that is certainly very important. Back in our minds is also an anthropocentric view of AI, where the ultimate goal is sort of imitating the human brain or something like that. I'm not that interested in humans, in the sense, okay, I do feel that imitating humans should not be the goal for AI, for several reasons. The first being, we already have plenty of humans. Not all of them are particularly intelligent. They are intelligent, but they are kind of asymptomatic, like with COVID. So they rarely behave in an intelligent way. And yeah.
I'm trying to pick out which are your controversial views in here.
Maybe I don't have. And so this doesn't make much sense to me. I'm exaggerating a little bit. I know that it's sort of caricature, but there is this fear in the back of my mind that if we imitate humans and if we succeed, then we are probably going to imitate the good things about us, but also the bad things about that. And I do think this makes a little bit sense. So, as I was saying before, or as I hinted before, I'm more interested on building systems that can expand our abilities and cooperate with us and so on and so forth. At the same time, and I was saying, we focus a lot in all these problem-solving and optimization areas, but if we think about us as human beings, creativity, aesthetic, games, ritualization, art making, jokes, all these aspects, these are what makes us humans. These are defining characteristics of the human mind. This is what defines us as human beings. There is quite a literal story about that, but let's move along, because I do get a lot distracted. And so if we don't imitate these things, if we don't replicate them in some way in a computer, we will not be able to build systems that are able to relate with us and understand our drives, our intentions, our goals, and so on. So I'm not saying we need to imitate humans, but an artificial agent that is useful for humans to cooperate with us should be able to understand us. And for that, we know all of these aspects. So this is a long answer. So when I look, the reason why I was fascinated with evolutionary computation is that it allows us to it's another form of intelligence. You can argue that evolution is creative, in the sense that over the years, the selection of species, survival of the fittest, and all these mechanisms were able to evolve intelligent beings like us. So they create a wide variety of species. Some of them are even intelligent, humans included, and so forth. So I like that a lot as a form of inspiration, trying to look at other phenomena, at nature and so on, and searching for different forms of inspiration to build AI systems. And now that I did a lot of that path, why not using also evolution to evolve artificial brains or artificial bodies or artificial systems that are also intelligent? Mm-hmm. Did that make any sense? Because I do feel that it was a long story.
You mentioned, I'm curious, you mentioned kind of a side note story about the linkage between kind of creativity and humanity.
Yeah.
And you said you didn't want to go there, but I'm curious what.
Now you want to go there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not the best to tell this story. Actually, I heard about this story by John McCormack, which is an Australian researcher and a dear friend, and you should definitely invite him for this podcast because he's a lot more interesting than me. And he told me this amazing story that really stuck into my mind. He told me this was in the conference maybe 3 years ago. It was pre-COVID, so whatever that means. Mm-hmm. And basically, the story goes like this. And I'm going to miss the names and the exact dates and so on, but the core of the story remains. So in Australia, as you probably know, they had historically lots of problems related with racism and so on. And Aboriginal people, I believe that's the right name to say it in English, until very recently, I believe it was the 60s, they were, and this is tricky to explain for a non-native speaker, but I'll try it. They were considered humans, but not persons. Meaning that, yes, they were recognized as being human beings, but they didn't have rights. So they could not own properties or, of course, vote and so on and so forth. So in terms of the law, they were not persons as the rest of the people. And there was this guy, Aboriginal guy, which he became a very famous painter. He did paint in a sort of European style because Aboriginal art is amazing, beautiful, but he was painting in a European style. And he became so well known that eventually the government considered him a person. So this is a very literal demonstration that art makes us persons. Of course, and I found it, imagine, this is, if you really think about it, I think it's in the 60s, so it wasn't that long ago. Mm-hmm. And B, the sheer fact of somebody being so good at art that nobody could say this is not a person, I find it fascinating. There is, of course, a sad, lots of sad notes to this story. He eventually died, as everybody dies, and his wife, his kids, his family, they were not persons, so they could not inherit the house, the goods, and so on. And I think this has been recently. The term is not correct, solved. Of course, this can never be solved, but I don't have the proper word in English. This was recently, they got back their inheritance a few years ago, I believe. So that's what I meant. And it is a sad story, but that's what I meant, that art is something that is very, very important to us, because not even in those circumstances you could deny, and it literally made him a person.
Mm-hmm. Interesting story. There's a lot there that I'm going to be looking over the next few days.
You should check the story with more detail, because I probably missed something here, but this was what stuck in my mind, and I find it absolutely fascinating. There are lots of other fascinating stories like this.
Mm-hmm. So I think, just kind of looping back, I think the couple of things that your arguments you're making are that, creativity, art being an example of that, is kind of has this fundamental humanness as exemplified by the story, and evolution also. I don't know if it's also as a fundamentally human thing. I mean, evolution is also, I guess, has kind of caught your interest as a way to evolve, not just how, species have evolved, but as a way, I mean, art evolves. So lots of things follow evolutionary.
Yeah, because you can talk about biological evolution, but you can also talk about memes and stuff like that, like Dawkins did. So you can look at it in different ways. Of course, there's also this effect. I worked with evolutionary computation for a long time. And then when you get really good at an area, you start thinking, okay, I have a hammer, everything is a nail. So there is also that effect. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that to build AI systems, and I'm not talking about... I'm talking about real AI, whatever that means, something generally intelligence. Mm-hmm. I do believe we do need to look a lot more to nature. And in my opinion, you only get intelligent beings, artificial or otherwise, if you have, okay, I would say that you need a very rich environment, a very demanding environment. You probably need something along the lines of coevolution, adversarial search or competition, and so on, just to drive evolution. You need to take into account probably need to take into account physical constraints. For instance, this is not a criticism. Actually, it is, but it's not that I think we are doing it wrong. But it's just think we need other steps. So, for instance, these models like GPT-3 or so on, that to train them, you need an insane amount of resources, and even to run them, you need an insane amount of resources, and they are still not as clever as us. I don't like the direct comparison, but they have limitations more than we do, or different ones, and they require a huge amount of computational power, a huge amount of energy, and so on. So we are definitely missing something here. And for instance, let's consider our brains. Okay, you cannot. Your brain is not fully connected. The neurons are not fully connected. A fully connected layer makes no sense. It would become it is to a large extent a wiring problem. There is no way of passing all the cables to fully connect it. So even think about modularity, for instance. Modularity can arise arguably from the need to solve this kind of sort of wiring problems. Why? Because you have an area of the brain that specializes in some given problem, and then this can be densely connected. But when you try to communicate with another area of the brain, you don't need to pass as many wires. Let's use this metaphor again. So the simple fact of that you are adding additional constraints like energy requirements, the ability to learn fast, the 3D nature of brains, all these things end up creating a pressure towards parsimony. They put also a pressure towards, in my experience, a pressure towards evolving structures that train fast and that use less resources. You can kind of reverse engineer that. And so evolutionary computation can be a way of reaching general intelligence. Mm-hmm. The other argument is, I have no idea of how to construct a brain, but maybe I can evolve it. So that's the short version of this answer. But I do think it does make a lot of sense. And probably you also need to revisit and improve some computational models of evolution tend to be sort of oversimplification of nature. And to be honest, I think we may be missing something there. And this is also one of the things that I'm trying to explore.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I recently mentioned in our newsletter that I'm following this course on the philosophy of science fiction, kind of a audio course. And it prompted me to rewatch the Matrix trilogy. Actually, I'd only ever watched the first one and not watched the second or third one because I'd heard that they were, not that interesting. Actually, they're really interesting. Okay. And, in particular, they may be the only sci-fi that I know of that to this degree kind of takes on the idea of evolution of intelligence, evolution of models. Like, I think it's common to think of, or at least that I'm familiar with. There's we talk about kind of artificial intelligence as learning, but in the second and third Matrix, they very explicitly talk about, this one intelligence evolved and another intelligence evolved, and they combined and they evolved another intelligence to try to address specific failings of the matrix as a system.
Fixing we would call that nowadays there were adversarial examples and they were trying to fix it. Yeah. I've never thought about that. I'm not sure if it's the only one. I do believe there is one or two tales by Isaac Asimov that touch those areas. Not entirely certain. I do believe, okay, maybe I'm making this up. I do believe there is a tale by Asimov where the computer or the robot, whatever you want to call it, gets stranded in a planet. So it is she, whatever, is isolated there and starts building other robots, and they start evolving in this way. And eventually they are isolated from humans, and eventually they find a human or vice versa, and they almost violate the laws of robotic because they could not believe that something so simple and so basic as us was their creator. So I can be making all of this up,
Well, I do not purport to be a sci-fi aficionado by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, I was, tended to be, I don't know, I'm hugely influenced by sci-fi, but mostly kind of pop sci-fi. And I'm just starting to get into kind of thinking deeply about it and the implications, and, plan to read more on Asimov and some of these other authors. But I think that, one of the questions that it prompts for me in the context of this conversation is kind of thinking about the relationship between learning and evolution. And maybe one way to state that is a lot of what we talk about, or what I've talked about on the podcast, is evolution as a learning strategy. And I'm curious, I'm curious more broadly, like how you think about the relationship between those two. But when we're using evolution as a learning strategy, it's not the thing that is choosing to evolve itself. Is there research in that direction? What does that look like? Can we get to self-directed evolution like way before we get to AGI, or does that need to be?
So okay, now I got the question. That's an excellent question. I have no idea. For a moment there, I thought you were going to talk about A life, and that could be a way of approaching this. There was a lot of interest in A life in the late 80s, early 90s, I believe, and then it kind of the interest diminished. But I do think there is a lot to be seen there. And answering to your question, I would say that probably having open-ended environment and a challenging one, it's probably, I wouldn't say the best, but to me it appears to be a promising way of building intelligence agents. The challenge would be, and I'm thinking as I speak, the challenge would be to ensure that world relates to the real world, whatever that means, because we are all living in the matrix. So all of this is a simulation anyway. So, but these two realities, not the right word, definitely need to be connected somehow, because otherwise it won't develop the same sort of intelligence that we need. I'm guessing here. And so yeah, and provided that the world is rich enough and you have speciation mechanisms and so on, probably also mating selection mechanisms. That's one of the things that is missing, well, not entirely missing, but is underappreciated in evolutionary computation, because you can make the argument that, and it has been made, the argument that intelligence, the evolution of intelligence may have been driven by simply by mating choice, which is certainly an interesting argument. So yes, if you can keep up a world like this, challenging, with lots of competition, with lots of opportunities, and where evolution does give you an evolutionary advantage, because it's not so when you think about it, it's not that obvious that being intelligent automatically grants you an evolutionary advantage, because our brains consume a lot of energy and so on. So ants are doing good and they are not particularly clever. Well, the ant colony can be considered clever, but ants individually are not that clever. So maybe intelligence is not necessarily a prerequisite for evolutionary success. I got lost, sorry. Totally lost. What was the question again?
Is maybe taking a step back or being more concrete, when you're talking about evolution from a computation perspective or evolutionary ML, is the concept of mating, is that definitional? In distinguishing between evolution as just kind of a word that it's getting better and evolutionary computation?
Yes, I would think so. I do. I think there is a reason why all intelligent species, at least as we tend to call it, resort to sexual selection. It can be explained in many different ways. There are certainly technical, well, not technical, but advantages in doing that in terms of fighting, getting rid of the trash in our genomes and so on. That argument has been made. But I do think that things like the problem is, I'll give you an example. Imagine you are a bird of some kind. You get stuck in an island with other individuals of your species. The food is, there's lots of food and so on. So there is no reason for you to evolve. You are perfectly adapted to that environment, and you are not going to evolve, and you don't need to get smarter. In fact, you can get dumber because you don't need a big brain. Everything is there for you. There are no problems to solve. And in some cases, yes, you can have a recess in that terms. But if you are using sexual selection, then you have to compete. Females have to compete with females for the attention of the males, and the males. And typically, that is mostly the case in nature. The males have to compete between themselves for the attention of the female. And this competition can take many different forms. For instance, direct competition between males with fights and so on. But for instance, peacock feathers, for instance, which are an ornament, they are detrimental to the individual. They exist because the females of the species like it. In the case of peacocks, this is trivial to prove. They only have those long, beautiful feathers during the mating season. They lose them because if you are a peacock and you are trying to fly away for a tiger, that huge tail is strongly detrimental. The same happens with paradise birds and so on. So why does this pertain to evolution? Because females need to be smart to figure out which are the best males to mate with, to choose their mating partners. And males also need to be smart to show these indirect or direct displays of fitness and so on. So the simple fact that you have sexual selection does create automatically a competition within the species that can drive evolution in ways that would not be feasible to occur by other means, because you don't need to have an adversary. You don't need to. It creates the need for evolution. It also creates, and this is why I like it so much, it also creates all this, from more my artistic side or visual side, it does create these beautiful ornaments. It does create these strange variations, these unfeasible animals, and so on. And this is fascinating, because in nature, the notion of being fit is quite abstract. You are fit if your genes survive in the long term. So you are not fit because you are stronger or smarter or more beautiful or whatever. It's all about long-term survival of your genes. So this creates a certain, how should I put it, subjectivity to the concept of fitness that I really enjoy from a more philosophical side of things. And at the same time, it does create some ways of coming up with ornamentations and so on. And I find it fascinating that, okay, we like peacock feathers. Think about this. We do like it. It's not by accident. So there must be some sort of aesthetical basis for this that is pretty much universal among humans and also shared maybe with other species. And that is extremely interesting. That was one of the reasons why I was fascinated with this in the beginning. The idea that aesthetical principles, not all, of course, but some of them could be shared among several species. They are probably strongly related with the way we and other species see and perceive images and so on. And this can be used for lots of different things. For instance, for information visualization, you need to understand a little bit on how the brain sees or how the brain creates images, because seeing is a creative act in some sense, to be able to build effective visualizations, So that's a lot how in my mind, which is a little bit weird, things connect one with each other.
So based on that description, you'd think that the kind of the mating algorithm, mating choices, selection process is an important kind of variable that distinguishes, one evolutionary approach to another.
Yeah.
Both biologically and computationally.
Oh, definitely. I strongly believe that. For instance, in canonical evolutionary computation models, it's all about survival of the fittest. So you do roulette wheel selection or tournament selection. It doesn't matter. And the probability of being chosen for as mating partner depends entirely on your fitness. It's probabilistic. We've tried to, we and the others before us, we try to implement methods that include a female mate choice. And it was the easiest one that we could implement. So for instance, in one of the models, in the first step, a female is chosen. Okay, so that in this case, the female drives the process. So the female is chosen according to her fitness, and then for instance, using tournament selection, you randomly pick a set of males, and then the female evaluates the different males, and this is going to be her mating partner. And interestingly enough, this shouldn't work really, because now you have to evolve two things. You have to evolve a candidate solution to the problem. The female must be fit to a given problem. So you need to evolve a candidate solution. And B, you need to evolve mating preference model, whatever you want to call it. So in practice, we do have two chromosomes. So since you have to evolve more things, it should be a lot harder, because you have to solve two different problems: how to evaluate and how to be fit. Interestingly enough, in some of or most of the problems, and we haven't tested thoroughly, there are lots of testings to be done, it works. So in symbolic regression problems, in several test beds, we came up to conclusion, for instance, that this model, where in this case the female has a sort of idea. It's a very romantic approach. Each female has this, and I'm not joking. The way we did it is like this. So one chromosome is a candidate solution to the problem. The other chromosome of the female represents her ideal mating partner. So it's whatever the female desires. It's encoded in her genes. And the different candidates are compared with this ideal mating partner. And the entire thing undergoes evolution. So these preferences can and are changes throughout time by mutations, crossover, and so on. And this actually works. It works rather well. It shouldn't, because it should be a lot tougher, but we came up, the results indicate that it's competitive, that typically you get the same or better performance than canonical approaches. It's very interesting to try to understand why, and I think, and we don't have a good explanation for that, but basically my intuition tells me, and some tests, it's not just intuition, the ability to evolve your preferences allows you to do cool things during the evolutionary process. So imagine when you are already in a later stage of the evolutionary process, where individuals are already very good, females are very good. So if the female is very good, you want to mate with a male that won't spoil your genes, that has a small impact on the quality of your descendants. And this sometimes implies choosing a mating partner that is quite basic, and in some cases it even has a very low fitness, but that won't spoil the genes. And this is very interesting to see. We constructed several visualizations about it, and you can clearly see the division of the population. We don't have sexes, by the way. Sexes naturally emerge, so they are just individuals, and if they are picked first, they work as females and otherwise as males. And as evolution goes on, it kind of naturally subdivides into two groups: a group that we'll call females because they are being selected by their fitness, and a group that we'll call males that are typically not that fit, but that females tend to prefer, and they are systematically selected by female mate choice. And I find this fascinating, just the emergence of sexes. Well, maybe just the division into subgroups, not necessarily sexes or genders, or because that may be taking the analogy too far. But the way they emerged naturally was totally surprising for us, because it just happens like this once you give the individuals the ability to choose the mating partners. And of course, my wife keeps on explaining to me, see, that this is what happens. That I had to tell that also.
Is there a way, how can you make that explanation more concrete in the context of machine learning, or you mentioned a regression type of problem? What are the genes? What are the selection strategies? What all those things correspond to?
Okay, so it's easier to explain with symbolic regression, for instance. So in symbolic regression, we are using genetic programming. It's a standard genetic programming approach, pretty much like COSAT is. So we are evolving these expressions, the code that once you execute it, you get a function over time. So that's the type of problem, to put it simple, that we are trying to solve. So how do you turn this into a sexual selection model or mate choice model, which I believe it's more appropriate in English? Difficult to explain. At this point, I would need to draw, but it's actually a very easy idea. So imagine that instead of having one program, and this is one of the ways that we do, imagine that instead of having one of these programs generating a curve, let's call it like that, you have two. So the first one, the first curve that you obtain, it's typical symbolic regression. You compare it with a given target, you measure using root mean square error or whatever, the performance, you assign fitness, that's done, that's easy. The second one. So the second one, it's used to evaluate mating partners. So what you are going to do is you draw this line, which is this ideal thing. And now when a male comes to be judged, you check his candidate solution, its mating curve, and you simply compare one with the other. So you are comparing the first chromosome that encodes the candidate solution with the second chromosome of the female. Actually, to be correct, sorry about that, you are comparing the phenotype resulting from the expression of the first chromosome with the phenotype or the curve resulting from the expression of the second chromosome. We do all of this in the phenotypic space and not at the genotypic space. So we never compare phenotypes, only their expression. And this gives you, of course, we are just comparing two curves. So once this works, and it apparently does, you can pretty much apply it to anything you want.
How are you comparing the two curves? I guess what I got from that explanation was the first part of that process is it's a kind of a loss error calculation.
Yeah. In the second part is also the same thing. So you are comparing the similarity of the curve of the male with the curve that expresses the sexual preference of the female. And so you can do, for instance, root mean square or any other measure that you want, provided, okay, to apply these sort of things, the only thing that you really need is a way of comparing two phenotypes. And if you can create a thesis that makes sense, then you should be able to apply it. Having said that, we only apply this to a small number of problems, so I don't know how it scales to different problems. I cannot prove that it's general enough. So, but we are going to try to fix that gap in the near future. Yes, so please go ahead. Sorry.
The first calculation is comparing the females or the first generated curve to the desired curve.
Yes.
Kind of your idealized error relative to your idealized. And the second is comparing the males to the female's preference. Where does the female preference curve come from?
It's evolved just like the other, so you have no control, and that's why it's difficult to explain. It's a product of evolution, so it's initialized randomly, and then there is no direct evolutionary pressure towards the female preferences. However, there is an indirect one. If they mate with males that and that results in bad offspring, their genes will not survive. So there isn't a direct one, but there is an indirect one, and this is enough to evolve preferences, let's call it like that, that are beneficial to evolution. That doesn't mean that it's choosing the fittest, the best, or you simply cannot explain it like that. It's very difficult to understand, because in different spots, in different parts of the evolutionary process, it may be choosing totally different things. So, for instance, in the beginning, it may be trying to find the fittest males, but after a while, it may be trying to find something else. Maybe it's just trying to find functions that are compatible. This is, in some sense, also results a bit by the nature of genetic programming, where crossover tends to be very destructive, at least in the later parts of the evolutionary process. So after a while, maybe it's better just to prevent destructive crossover than to try to select the fittest one.
Mm-hmm. And so this, what are some of the ways that you apply this in the machine learning domain?
In the machine learning domain, we are trying to apply it now. To be honest, in evolutionary machine learning, we fight a big problem for us, but which is the lack of computational resources. We have like 8 GPUs or something like that. So we are not Google at all. So this makes the experimentation a little bit more complicated. But I'm not complaining about that. We'll do fine with that. So what we are doing now is...
if I can jump in, is the idea that because of the nature of evolutionary computation, your training is multiplied by the number of, or the breadth or dimensionality of your evolutionary universe. I'm not sure what the right terms are, but
by the size of the population or something like that. Yes, that does complicate a little bit the problem, and that's also a big difference between nature and in silico experiments. In nature, we have the entire Earth, and you can run millions or billions of individuals at the same time without an extra cost. Well, there is a cost for the environment, but I'm not talking about that. And you need to have computational resources, so it doesn't map directly. Anyway, the way we are approaching that lack of computational resources is a little bit trying to let's work with that. So if we have fewer computational resources, we must come up with ways of evolving faster, of being more efficient, and so on. We can't turn that into an advantage. Of course, I would like to have a lot more, but it's not a huge problem nowadays. We can still cope. So going back to your question, what we are doing now is we are testing it again in the image domain, and we are trying to... The first thing that we are doing is we have these networks for generating images that combine with evolutionary... Story is long, and we are trying to co-evolve at the same time. So each individual will be... Actually, if you want to be picky about it, 3 different networks, 2 of them for generating purposes, and the second/third one, this one on the side, it's going to evaluate the images generated by other individuals. So in this way, we would have all that we need to theoretically be able to evolve individuals that create images that are attractive to other individuals of the same species. And this does probably... There are a few papers written a long time ago about coevolution of images and so on, for instance, by Gary Greenfield. But what we are expecting to to understand out of this is how trends evolve over time, or how they appear, how they evolve, and how they are replaced. Because even from an evolutionary standpoint, you can compete with, let's call it, other males by being better than them at their game, or by differentiating and creating something new. And yes, you want to attract a big part of the population, probably, but you can have your own niche, and that niche later on can become more predominant. This is from a more aesthetical or artistic, I prefer the term aesthetical side of view. From a more, I hate the term, but let's call it a practical point of view, we believe that we can do pretty much the same thing for medical image. We'll see where that goes. I don't have the results. But in theory, the approach should also be, it can be applied. I'm not sure if it will get good results or not. That only time will tell.
Okay. Is all of the work that you do on the computational creativity side focused on the evolutionary computation, or is it a Venn diagram that has its own?
There is one. There are several. No, the stuff that we do on computational creativity, okay, every now and then we use evolution for, but typically use it more for as a strategy that we use within our systems, that something that is an end in itself. In the beginning, I did use it a lot to evolve images and so on. But for instance, my students, most of them, well, actually, they use it now and then, but they are doing other things. So, for instance, in computational creativity, we are mostly interested in stuff like computational statics. That's my personal interest, but also about computer-aided creativity, about new media, stuff that is more related with art, and, for instance, comparing and contrasting human vision with computer vision and so on. I can tell you a little bit about that later, but also about computational blending, coming up with concept representative symbols, stuff like creating emojis. And yes, I have a student, well, this is not his PhD thesis, this is what I tell João Cunha when I'm teasing him. I'm telling, okay, you are going to be the first guy that this is on creating new emojis. Imagine you from telling your kids, yes, I'm the guy, the emoji guy. But for instance, stuff like that, coming up with new emojis. For instance, imagine that, okay, I from memory, I have a good one for you. So in his system, he was trying to come up with a visual representation for the concept cat without using the emoji for cat. So by using WordNet, you can derive a lot of information about cats and the relations and so on. So the system naturally came out with this emoji that I find very interesting, which is a mouse with a search how do you call it? A loop, magnifier glass, sorry, on top of that. And that's clever. You know, so a cat is something that is searching for a mouse. That's the sort of thing that it's very provocative. We also have another one that is really cool, that is about flags and changing the country flag according to something that is happening on the news. So imagine that you have United States and oil. It could, for instance, and I'm making this up, replace every single star on your flag by a barrel of oil or something like that. And it also does this kind of automatically, let's call it like that. So we have another one which I'm really interested on that, but it's in the beginning, which is the idea of evolving, and yes, but here it's not in the evolutionary sense, or it can be, but evolving interaction. So imagine something that learns how you want to interact with it, and over time it adapts naturally to the way you interact. I don't know if you how old you are. Did you play with arcades and stuff like that, arcade machines?
Sure.
So yeah, I would assume so. So, for instance, when I was playing in the arcades, every now and then you run out of money, and the machine, entered that demo mode, and some of the times you were like simulating that you are playing. So something was happening on the screen, and you are moving the joystick and hitting the buttons and so on. So yeah, our current idea is, okay, let's do that. The computer is playing, the computer is doing something, and the user is trying to control what is on the screen. It's not actually controlling, but it's trying to control, and the computer is learning what the inputs of the user are and mapping that to an effect. So you invert all the idea of designing interface to something that really gives the ability of the user to, maybe we want to control that crazy spaceship by shouting at the mic, and that's fine. That's where I want to take that, and obviously that would be insane. At the same time, probably extremely useful for people with disabilities, with difficulties, stuff like that. But at this stage, we feel comfortable at this level of gameplay, creativity, and so on. It's not the idea. Maybe in long term can be used for more serious goals, but that's the kind of thing that interested us. We also do lots and lots of experiments with typography and stuff like that, because I work with lots of designers. But computational creativity, for me, it's more the fun side, where anything goes. I can do whatever I want. I can do artistic projects and have I would say, entire freedom, but that's such a thing that never exists.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Penousal, thanks so much for taking time to share a bit about what you're up to. Lots of fascinating stuff, and I feel like I need to go dig into evolutionary computation more.
Yeah.
Of
Well,
ideas.
I hope it was interesting for you and not extremely confusing, because I do digress a lot, but well, I did my best, and it was very nice talking to you. It really was.
Conversation.
I enjoyed this a lot. Thanks.
All right.